Thank you very much, Michelle, and welcome everyone to this session. I will be talking about just the topic of interest, air pollution from fossil fuel combustion in children's health, and the benefits of action. I think there's some feedback on my speaker. Should I turn something off? We're okay. I love these quotes, particularly the first one, the Native American proverb, "We don't inherit the earth from our ancestors, we borrow it from our children." And Jack Kennedy, the summer before he died, said, "Children are the world's most valuable resource and its best hope for the future." And I think that's what we're all thinking about very deeply today. Now, emissions from fossil fuel combustion, I'm talking about coal, oil, gas, gasoline, diesel, even natural gas to some extent. These emissions are contributing 80% of toxic air pollutants and about 90% of CO2, the main human-produced driver of climate change. And the toxic air pollutants include all of these, this alphabet soup: PM 2.5, particulate matter in the fine respirable range, the larger particles, PM 10, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, or PAH for short, nitrogen dioxide, black carbon, mercury, sulfur dioxide, and precursors of ozone, which is a very strong respiratory irritant. And alongside these toxic air pollutants are emitted vast quantities of CO2. 32 billion metric tons of CO2 every year are emitted from fossil fuel combustion globally. And also the production and distribution of fossil fuel creates and releases methane, the second most important climate-altering gas. And there is synergy between these in that, I think I skipped something here. Let's see. Okay. All right, I didn't, I'm all right. So climate change brings us changes in temperature, in precipitation frequency, stagnation of air, and as we know, extreme weather events. And we've talked about more forest fires and more allergens being produced in the conditions of climate change. And there's synergy here because at higher temperatures, more ozone is formed. The formation is accelerated at elevated temperatures from these precursors. We also have synergism because forest fires, as we've heard in the previous panel, release enormous amounts of particulate matter, adding to the burden of air toxics on the left. Now, we've been talking earlier about the susceptibility of the fetus and child. I'll just run through that with a few examples. So the very rapid development of the brain is illustrated by the fact that of the 86 billion neurons or nerve cells in the adult brain, most are formed during those first 9 months while we are in utero. And the same thing with the respiratory system. The lung starts as a tiny bud, and at the end of 9 months is a fully functioning organ system. And so the rapid development means that these systems, as they develop, are very susceptible to interference, disruption by toxic exposures, by stressors due to trauma, and other factors related to climate change. The young, both the fetus and young child, have less ability to defend themselves. They don't clear the toxics as well as adults. They don't detoxify them. Those are enzyme systems that are really immature at that stage. And we now know a lot about the seeding of chronic disease in this early window of development. So, for example, neurodegenerative disease may be associated with damage incurred very early on in those first months and years of life. And as we heard earlier, there's great vulnerability to psychosocial stressors, trauma, stress due to poverty or racism. Now, there's also a growing burden of impaired development and childhood illness, and this has been occurring over the last decades. Globally, 15 million preterm births are occurring every year, and almost 400,000 in the U.S. 15% of children in the U.S. are affected by at least one developmental disorder, ADHD, a learning disorder, intellectual disability, and 10 to 20% of children globally have of children and adolescents suffer from a mental disorder. 8% of children in the US have asthma, and the prevalence globally is about the same. And as we know, these impacts they don't just disappear after childhood, but they do persist, and they can also lead to further harmful effects in older people. So life course effects from this early damage. There are multiple health effects associated with air toxics: infant mortality, preterm birth, low birth weight, asthma, neurodevelopmental outcomes, effects including reduced IQ, even autism, and ADHD have been associated with these pollutants, and possibly cancer in children. CO2 induced or related climate change is related to some of the same effects. You can see there's some correspondence: preterm birth, low birth weight, allergy and asthma exacerbation, and neurodevelopmental effects. Malnutrition leads to stunting not only of the body but also of the brains of children. And infectious disease and heat-related illness are linked to climate change and trauma, both physical and psychological. And here, too, you can imagine there is synergy or combined effects, such that a child who's already impaired by air toxics will be more vulnerable to those adverse impacts of climate change. Say, a child with asthma related in part to air toxics will have more risk of exacerbation of asthma, triggering of attacks in the face of climate change-related more air pollution, and also more allergens. So you can see that we must really consider these things holistically. We can't just take them and put them in pigeonholes. We have to think of all the health impacts of fossil fuel. Environmental injustice is a major theme with climate change and air pollution, both in several ways. First, disproportionate exposure of the poor and certain racial and ethnic groups to toxic air pollution and impacts of climate change has been seen both in the US, in developed countries, and also in the developing world as well. And children bear the brunt of both. So the statistics from the World Health Organization are that 40% of environmentally related disease that burden is borne by children less than 5 years of age. And 88% of disease related to climate change is borne by this same group of very young children. Now, worldwide, astonishing number, 1 billion children, almost half of children living today, are living in poverty. And in the United States, the world's richest economy, it's 22% of children living in poverty. And environmental and socioeconomic and psychosocial stressors can interact to magnify the adverse health effects. So we have environmental justice on several counts. Now, I want to take you, that somebody said yesterday, I'll take you down and then I'll bring you up with some optimism and some good news. So see, your face is getting longer. But I'll show you a little bit of our research at the Columbia Center for Children's Environmental Health. We have ongoing 3 cohorts, one in New York City, or actually 3 in New York City, one in Poland, and another in China. And there is surprising consistency in the associations that we've seen between prenatal exposure to the PAH, these combustion-related pollutants that are found in the fine particle fraction, and adverse birth outcomes, cognitive behavioral problems, and where we've looked at them so far, asthma and respiratory problems. So consistency across different settings and different ethnic groups. Now, in New York City, what we've done to measure PAH, we have small backpack monitors. I think I might have a pointer, but I haven't figured that out yet, so it's okay. So you see a small backpack monitor being worn by a pregnant woman, and that's one way that we record the levels of PAH air pollutants she and her fetus, her developing fetus, are exposed to. We also look at this biomarker of exposure. Oh, yes, there it is. This biomarker, which is like a smudge on DNA. That black blob is a PAH, member of that class of PAH. bound to DNA, and we can measure that down to very low levels, and we do that in maternal blood collected at delivery and also umbilical cord blood. And what we have seen is significant associations between these measures of exposure, one or both, and reduced birth weight and head circumference, neurodevelopmental problems, delayed development, reduced IQ, which is on the order of what's seen with low-level lead, about 3 to 4 IQ points, behavioral problems, symptoms of anxiety, depression, and ADHD, and decreased emotional regulation capacity. And a subset of the children were imaged by magnetic resonance imaging at the age of 7 to 8, and anatomical brain changes were associated with higher levels of exposure to PAH. We also have seen that there are interactions, significant interactions, between the pollutant and material hardship due to poverty, both on IQ and ADHD. And finally, asthma and allergic sensitization are associated with prenatal PAH exposure in our cohort. In Poland, we've used the same methods, methods of monitoring and biomarker, and the same biomarker, and followed these children as well. And we do see reduced birth weight, smaller head circumference here as well, these different problems in neurodevelopment, reduced intelligence reduction similar to what we're seeing in New York, and behavioral problems, interactions again with material hardship on IQ reduction, respiratory symptoms, effects on lung function. And I should point out that in our studies, we do adjust for other factors that could confound or explain the finding with PAH. And we do that very rigorously, and that was true for the prior slide as well. Now, here's where we start to come up out of the bog, showing that there are direct, immediate benefits of actions to reduce fossil fuel pollution. In this case, a very polluting coal plant, centrally located in the city, in a city in Chongqing municipality. This plant is small, but it was filthy. It had no controls, burned very dirty coal. We enrolled a cohort here before the plant was shut down, and a second cohort that was conceived after the plant was closed. And we compared the first group to the second, or I should say the second to the first. And here's what we found. During the pregnancy, the ambient air levels of PAH were significantly reduced in that second cohort post-closure. There were improved birth outcomes. The adduct levels, this biomarker we call PAH-DNA adduct, was significantly lower in the second cohort. We no longer saw significant associations between PAH exposure and developmental scores, and here's the child being tested at age 2. We found levels of a very important brain neurotrophin, brain-derived neurotrophin, BDNF, were significantly higher in the second cohort, and that's very good news at the molecular level. Also, longer telomeres in cord blood, and telomeres are the caps on the ends of chromosomes, which get shorter as we age or under stress, and we've shown they are related to toxic air pollutants, and that in the second cohort, the telomeres were longer, indicative of better health and longer longevity. That's a general marker of health and longevity. So another piece of good news. Now we know that there are huge costs of air pollution and climate change, and the numbers are quite staggering, really. Up to 900 billion a year in health costs due to fossil fuel produced electricity in the US each year. 3.5 trillion a year of costs of ambient air pollution in OECD countries, in India and China. In London, the health costs of air pollution are estimated at 4.8 billion US dollar equivalent in pounds, and air pollution in China, 69 billion in 2005. Studies have shown that $14 billion in health costs were attributed to 6 climate change-related events in the US. But I point out that Hurricane Katrina has been estimated to have cost a total, this is total true costs, of $250 billion, and health costs are a good chunk of that. So the health costs are enormous. solutions exist, and they are working, and we've been hearing a lot about that at this summit, that their regulations, policies on air pollution and climate change are working to bring down the levels of pollution and mitigate climate change, shifting to clean modes of power generation and clean technologies for industrial emissions, low emissions vehicles, and then a lot of focus on buildings, improving energy efficiency, and cities, making cities more compact, more walkable, providing urban transit and rail interurban travel. All these things we're hearing about at this summit, and they are working. And there are huge estimated economic benefits of current initiatives operating now. Avoided health costs attributed to the U.S. Clean Air Act amendments, $2 trillion a year by 2020. And the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which is including 9 states in the northeastern part of the U.S., maybe more now, $5.7 billion in public health benefits. The Climate Change Initiative here in California is estimated to gain $8 billion in avoided health costs by 2025. And, I gave you the punchline here, retirement of 150 U.S. coal plants between the years 2010, 2013 gave an estimated almost $2 billion in avoided health impacts. But benefits assessments omit many, in fact, most of the significant outcomes in children, resulting in undercounting of health and economic benefits. And my team at the Columbia Center for Children's Environmental Health, and other colleagues are working to flesh out these case studies and really put the face of children on the benefits and also expand the economic argument. And I'll give you a thumbnail. I have 2 more minutes. In New York City, California, and in Krakow, Poland. So in New York City, during the Bloomberg years, 2002 to 2013, there are a number of policies that were enacted to clean up the buses. The dump dirty diesels was one slogan. Clean taxis, more mileage efficient. Clean heat in boilers, residential boilers, to improve air pollution levels. And our team is looking to see, first, what is the relationship to levels of air pollution in the city? What is the relationship of the trends in air pollution, if we see them, to low birth weight, preterm birth, childhood asthma? This is at the population level. And very importantly, are benefits shared equally among the different populations, the different communities? We have some initial good news in that the levels of fine particles, PM 2.5, measured at the birth residences of the New York City cohort I described earlier, have declined from 2000 to 2016, and that's a significant decline. At the same time, we looked at the levels of the PAH in these from the backpack monitors worn by the women during pregnancy, and we've been enrolling successive cohorts of women, and you can see here too that there is a good downward trend. So initial good news on that score. Now in California, this is just a little tiny example of a benefit of closing 8 coal and oil power plants in the state over a period of 10 years. And just looking at one of the benefits to children, it's been estimated that there are now 110 fewer preterm births due to that closure of those plants, with a saving of over $7 million, almost $8 million. And that's using a very conservative estimate of the actual cost per case, which is only a partial accounting. So that number really will be larger when we do that. Now in Krakow, very quickly, 18 seconds. Here is where the women and children have been living in Krakow. Those dots are where they live. And in the city, and I've seen it and breathed it often, there have been high levels of smog due to coal burning. And the main source has been these small coal burning stoves in individual homes, individual buildings. And a very powerful citizens group allied with pediatricians and physicians gathered together to form this smog alert movement, and they have been effective in bringing this problem to light. And now there is be put in place in 2019 an actual ban on coal burning in these residential stoves. Other policies were put into action sooner, so you see a downward trend. But we expect to see a nice sharp drop after that ban. So in summary, this is what I told you. Multiple effects of fossil fuel pollution on children's health, globally and in the US, a disproportionate burden on children, especially poor children and children of color, but all children are affected. We all gain if we take action, multiple health benefits from reducing dependence, corresponding economic benefits, and a need for child-centered policies on air pollution and climate change. By protecting this most vulnerable group, we protect everyone. And this is both the greatest challenge and the greatest opportunity of our time, and I'm quoting from a Lancet report of 2015. And if you want to read more, here's a reference, sort of an overview that I gave, a commentary that provides the nitty-gritty. Thank you. Okay. Oh my gosh. I want to acknowledge the other investigators, our colleagues, and our Chinese partners and Polish partners.
It's going to take a village, right?
Team effort, really.
Yeah. We're opening it up to questions. This is, and I'll start if there's not someone. If you have a question, please raise your hand and identify yourself. Why don't we start? I'll save my question for the end.
And just a little housekeeping that you'll need to speak into the microphone so the live stream.
Because we're live streaming.
My name is Mario DiBernardo with the California Department of Justice. You had a slide, multiple health effects, and in it you list a number of health effects related to CO2 emissions. I was wondering if you could go into detail a little bit more on how CO2 actually creates those health impacts.
So I'm talking about CO-related climate change. These are the if you will, or some. So these are the impacts of climate change on health. Thank you for clarifying that.
So like, would it be smoke and
so let me
extreme
just,
temperatures?
Yeah. So climate change brings elevated temperatures, precipitation frequency changes, air stagnation in certain areas. It promotes the formation of allergens. I think I'm going to find this in a minute if I don't get you all too dizzy. Yeah. So going back to the impacts of climate change, let's see. Okay. And more extreme weather events, right? More forest fires and allergens are produced. And through those mechanisms, we have more illness, related illness, more adverse birth outcomes, more allergy and asthma exacerbation, and so forth. Thank you very much for clarifying. This is not directly the direct toxicity of CO2 per se. Thank you.
Could you pass the microphone to the gentleman in front, and then we'll come to you next.
Well, thank you. That was a fantastic talk. I'm Zulfi Bhutta from the Center for Global Child Health in Toronto and the Aga Khan University. I'm also the president of the International Pediatric Association. One of the areas that we are working in globally is the whole relationship of conflict and child health in its wider dimensions. Yes. So my specific question to you is, how much do we know about the impact of many of these air toxins or toxic environmental changes, particularly in conflict zones where you have release of all kinds of things that I don't need to get into? Is there any evidence on the kind of technologies that you've used that we are dealing with an emergency that could have multiplier effects in those very environments?
I think you've put your finger on a very important understudied area, but certainly levels of air pollution combined with the trauma and the displacement, forced migration, all of that stressors combine to affect children in a very often in a long-lived way. So you have mental health problems in addition to physical actual illness, such as we've been talking about here, asthma and so forth. Absolutely, it's an important area, and we know how to study it. But we would have to be able to go to those places and do the studies.
So I was specifically referring to things that have to do with the use of mass armaments, particularly airstrikes, uranium. Many of these toxic chemicals related from airstrikes.
Yes,
And we actually have no data.
that's right.
They're there.
That's right.
And they're there in concentrations that may be many, many folds greater than what any coal industry may put out.
Absolutely. It should be a priority for study. I agree.
I think this gentleman's next. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Afif El Hassan. I'm with the American Lung Association. I'm also a pediatrician. Thank you very much for this wonderful talk. We're seeing a significant increase in diagnosis of autism. And you did mention it a little bit, especially when you mentioned neurodevelopmental effects.
Yes.
Can you elaborate a little bit further? As you know, we're dealing with people, anti-vaccines, all these other things. I think pollution is really the main culprit here. But any comments on specific correlations between specific toxins or just the climate in general that you're seeing with autism?
Yes. So ASD is referring to autism spectrum disorder. And a number of studies have linked particulate matter in the fine respirable range and pollution from traffic, particularly proximity to roadways, diesel pollution, so forth, to autism. There are 3 very good studies in the US that have shown that association, and an analysis of all 3 combined concluded that there was a significant increase. Now, it's not that air pollution is the only factor. These are multifactorial, but it is a preventable risk factor, and that's where we're at. We're trying to learn more. Well, we know enough to know that we can prevent a good portion of these diseases, disorders, by taking action now on fossil fuel combustion pollutant. So thank you.
Thank you.
We can take one more question, and then we'll have questions at the end as well.
So I'm David Pollack. I'm a psychiatrist from Oregon Health and Science University. Is it possible to tease out or look at the confounding variables that might be coexisting, such as, especially in utero, fetal exposure to alcohol, drugs, as well as nutritional impacts from the mother's food consumption or lack thereof?
Yes, it is. And I keep thinking there's a mic. Yes, it is possible. We don't do it perfectly, but we do attempt to measure and adjust for those factors to the extent possible. So, So I can tell you more about the specifics, but yes, certainly it is possible to do that, both with biologic markers like what I've described for the fingerprint biomarker and by a food frequency questionnaire, say for nutrition or more traditional methods.
What are the impacts of additives to make things worse for those?
Well, where we've looked at interactions with psychosocial stressors due to poverty, for example, material hardship and maternal demoralization, there we do see interactions with the physical toxicants.
Thank you, Ricky.
You're very
We'll bring you
welcome.
back up later.
Sure.